I finished the globe project in the last video, and I really wanted to make a stand for it. Right now it just sits as a big sphere. And you can hold it in your hand, but it really isn't displayed. So I sketched through a few ideas. I was beginning to like the look of the globe cradled in a single arm, and that arm made from a segmented ring, and the segments would line up with the degrees of latitude on the globe. The other thought I was having was that as you're looking at the globe, you're in space looking at the Earth. So I like the idea of the stand sort of having a space theme. The ring that I was coming up with to cradle the globe, I was beginning to like the idea that maybe it was a rocket trail, and the rocket was above the globe and the trail of smoke behind the rocket was the thing holding up the globe. Then for the actual stand, at first I was just thinking of a big wood-turned cone-shaped thing, but that just seemed like what I always do. I just make a bunch of rings and I glue them together and would turn them into something. So I thought maybe it would be more interesting, in keeping with the space theme, that I made a telescope tripod for the globe to sit on. And I came up with something more like this, with the tripod holding the ring on the top, and the ring is then holding the globe. So I started at first thinking I would make a quick prototype, and I made the piece at the top of the legs that holds the three legs together. This was helpful in going through this process, but I was beginning to get impatient with making a prototype, and I really just wanted to start in on the actual project. As the globe is maple and walnut, I wanted something that would work with that but be different. So I have this cherry that I got from a neighbor's tree, and I had cut it up into somewhat small pieces. I think this was the end of 2018, so I think it's been 3 years since I cut this up. And it's been sitting behind the drill press, and it should be dry enough to use now. And as the pieces aren't real big, it's sort of a nice size for this project, as I mostly need little pieces to make the tripod and the ring. So I pulled some of this cherry out from behind the drill press. It'll be nice to get this area cleaned up as well. So I jointed and planed and ripped pieces down on the bandsaw. The first part I was going to make is the lower section of the legs, and those are just going to be 3 square sticks. These pieces of cherry were fairly warped, so I cut them roughly to the length I was going to need. Less bend in the piece, because it's shorter, means I have to joint off less to get it flat. So it takes quite a bit to get down to a nice straight piece. And I can cut the pieces into close to the final shape. These lower sections to the leg will be bolted to the upper sections of the leg, and I wanted a little bit of adjustment. So I cut 2 slots into these lower sections of the leg. This will allow this piece of the leg some adjustability in where it gets bolted. I cut them to a final length. I also wanted the bottom end of this part of the leg to be tapered just slightly. Not really coming to a point, as it's wood, but just tapered a little bit. So it looks a little more like a foot or a point, I guess. And I did this 3 times, once for each leg, although it went really quickly. Then the upper section of the legs are the same section, the same stick basically, but I tapered the lower sections of these legs. I thought that would look a little nicer. So where they're bolted to the lower section will be slightly thinner. I clamped the upper and lower sections together to sort of see how they would look and how they would work. And I could start to put the tripod together. But first I needed to make the little top piece that would hold all three legs together. This is the piece that I made the prototype of. Now I can make the version of this out of cherry. So I got out another piece of the cherry and cut it into a strip and got that planed. I found the center of this piece. Then I can cut a 30-degree point into the end of this piece. Then cut off a set length and do this 3 times. And this gives me 3 segments that I can glue together to make the 3 pieces for the legs. I wanted to do it this way so that where the legs attach, the grain is coming out from the center. If I did this out of one single slab, one of the leg attachment pieces would be correct, but the other 2 would have side grain running towards the leg, and that would be just much weaker. And this is just sort of a nice detail to have at the top. All of that was to just make a piece that I could then cut out a smaller piece on the CNC machine. So this cherry was destined just to be firewood, so I don't feel too bad about using a somewhat big piece to get down to a very little piece that goes on the top of the tripod. And I can sand a little bit, get it to its final shape. Now I can put the 3 legs together. At this point, I'm just using clamps to hold everything. The idea is that the 2 upper sections of the legs are parallel, and I can attach different things within that space between the 2 sides of the legs. The top piece, the midpoint bracket or sort of support piece, and then the lower sections of the legs. Now that the 3 legs seem to be working, I can start to make the holes for all of the bolts that will hold everything together. This is the hole at the top. Now I need to find on the upper section of the leg where my slot is that I cut on the lower section of the leg. And my pencil I found didn't fit into the slot. So I wood turned or sort of sharpened on the lathe a section of pencil so the pencil could fit down into that slot, and I could mark where that slot is on the upper leg. My slots weren't exactly centered, so I couldn't just sort of measure and figure out where that should be. Then I can drill those holes centered in that slot. And I set up the other drill press to do the countersink. I was having a little trouble with it being sort of rough, and I'm not sure I'm really using the right kind of countersink. I don't know if this is really meant for metal drilling or if there's something special for wood countersinking. It worked, but it wasn't quite as smooth as it should have been. And I rounded over the outer sections of the legs. Because the legs are tapered, the lower bolt I was going to have to cut a little shorter, and the upper bolt I had to sink into the section of the leg just a little bit. I got some little bit nicer brass bolts, so they're a little nicer than sort of construction grade stuff. The lower bolts I had to cut just a little bit off the end to make them the right length. So I attached some nuts, which allowed me to hold this piece in the vise. Then I could just cut off the end. Also, having the nuts on the bolt meant that once I was finished with the cut, I could turn the nuts off the bolt, and that'll sort of clean up the thread a little bit where the cut's been made. And the reason why the bolts have to be a somewhat precise length is I got nuts that are capped to go on the outside end of the bolts. So the length of the bolts is somewhat critical, but it looks a little nicer this way, a little more finished. So you can see where the bolt's on the surface and then where I had to sink the nut into the cherry just a little bit. Then I can start to put these together. I kept wanting to see if everything was working as I was making pieces.
Bed goes up, bed goes down, bed goes up.
At this point, I wanted to make the lower support on the legs. I was going to have a piece that would run between the three legs inside the space that they make. And this will sort of hold the legs nice and rigid. So what I need are three pieces that run from the space in the legs into the center of the tripod. And I looked at doing a joint between those three pieces. I couldn't figure out how this would keep the pieces parallel to the legs inside that gap in the legs. So what I ended up doing was making a part sort of similar to the piece at the top that would connect the three supports that reach out to the legs. So I cut sort of a puzzle piece joint into the centerpiece, and then I had to cut the positive into the ends of the supports. And I did this 3 times. And I cut those pieces to length. And I put that system together. I was going to glue this, but they were tight enough, I decided I could just leave the glue out. And if I ever have to take this apart, I can do that. And it seems to be plenty strong without the glue. Then it was a matter of getting this piece into the legs, and the end of each of these is held with a bolt. This is the bolt that sunk into the cherry just a little bit, because the legs are a little wider here. Once I have that set up and everything seems to be working, I can attach the legs at the top. Since I had a hole that I had drilled on the drill press, I could use that as a guide to hand drill the hole through the top piece of the tripod. And I drilled in on both sides so I would get a hole in the center that would take the bolt all the way through. If I drilled through only from one side, I may not hit the other side of the leg exactly perfectly. That's why I did that. I had gotten some slightly longer bolts. I think these are 4-inch bolts for the top, and that actually worked out perfectly. I didn't have to cut them or sink them. And the tripod part is done and seems nice and solid. I can start to work on the ring that actually holds the globe. I started by cutting out a prototype piece out of foam core, both to see what my idea was going to look like that I had sketched, and to be able to measure the size of the globe. I didn't have really a way to measure the diameter of the globe precisely. So I could put this piece around the globe and kind of see how big to cut the final wooden piece. So I needed to make a segmented ring. Before I did that, I needed to make a wedge for my sled so I could cut the segments for the ring. I made a prototype ring at first, and that worked, and it was exactly the right size, and all the things that I thought I was going to be making sure of with the prototype worked out just fine. It was the right size, and it was going to be able to fit the piece that I was going to cut out of it. But the thing that I learned, and the giant mistake I made, was that I kept thinking of the number of degrees between the equator and the North and South Pole as 100 for some reason. So I kept thinking I needed a 40 segment ring, so I would have 10 segments in each quadrant. But what I realized when I was putting the ring together was that I need 9 segments in each quadrant, because a right angle is 90 degrees, not 100 degrees. What I needed was a 36 segment ring. So I recut my wedge at 10 degrees instead of 9 degrees and made the cherry ring a 36 segment ring. And I kept track of the order of each segment so I could have the grain somewhat continuous as it goes around the ring. I cleaned up each segment. Then I could put my ring together. The prototype ring went together perfectly with no gaps. The final ring, actually, the angle wasn't exactly perfect, so I ended up with some gaps in the ring. But that was okay because my idea was to make the ring in two halves. A half that I would use and then a half that doesn't get used, but I could use it to make the arms that I wanted to have coming off the main ring. I also wanted to add a accent piece at the North and South Pole and the equator. And I looked at some different woods for doing that, and I decided I didn't want a huge contrast, so I found a scrap piece of walnut that was mostly sapwood, so it was sort of a light walnut, and I decided I could use that as the accent pieces. And once I had everything cut, I could start gluing. I put some little spacers in where I was going to not have glue and would separate the two different pieces that I would get out of this ring. And doing it that way, gluing up all 36 segments plus the 3 inserts was going to be difficult in one shot. It was nice to be able to glue up half, let that set up a little bit, and then glue up the other half. And I can let that dry now. I have my 2 sections. I guess one's a little smaller than half. So the idea was to attach that piece that I wasn't really going to need to the side of the piece I was going to use. I found the center and used that as my 0, point. And I cut an arc into the outside of the main piece. And I looked at how that was going to work with the other piece, and I cut to the other side of that arc into the secondary piece. And if all goes well, those pieces should fit together, and they seem to. So now I can glue those 2 pieces together, and this gives me this sort of weird shape that I can work with. And clamping this was fairly straightforward, even though it's curved. And once that was set up, I added some tabs so I could hold this on the CNC machine. So I glued some more pieces to this. And the tabs are the right thickness for the hold downs that I have. So then I flattened the top of this. And in the end, I ended up attaching this to the tripod a little differently than I had thought. I just attached this to that top triangular piece instead of wood turning a piece that would go between this and the tripod. So I didn't need the little arm at the bottom. So all of that gluing that secondary piece on was completely unnecessary. It was nice to know that I could do something like that, I guess. So my segmented half ring piece ended up being simpler than I had it originally. And I sanded that piece and rounded over the outside of it. Now I've been going over different ideas for how to actually hold the globe in the ring piece. My first thought was to put a finish nail into the North and South Pole and cut the head off the nail and have that nail sit inside a bolt with a hole drilled in it. But in looking at the globe, I really didn't even want to damage it that much. So my thought at this point was to hot glue a washer to the North and South Pole, then cut a little knob into the top of a bolt, and that knob will ride inside the washer. And hopefully I can adjust the bolts at the North and South Pole in and out to tighten up the grip on the globe. And hopefully the hot glue is strong enough to hold the washers in place. Possibly I should have actually used a wood screw or sort of a wood bolt here. I don't know, through the process of how I was doing this, I ended up with these flat, more machine bolts going into the wood. And they seem to hold okay. And I think I could hold them on the metal lathe a little better to do the top piece. I can attach the ring piece to the top of the tripod. This is where I was going to have a wood-turned piece here with a slot in it that held the ring piece, and it ended up seeming really complicated. And I could just bolt this ring to this top plate of the tripod. So I just have 2 screws from underneath. I can glue the washers to the globe. I'm hoping this isn't too permanent, or that it's strong enough to work but not permanent. I was also wondering about maybe my ring piece should have been like a big clothespin kind of thing where it's got a big spring on it and it sort of clamps onto the globe, and that's what holds it in place. That could have been cool too. So if this doesn't really work over time, maybe something like that might happen. But for now, this seems to work. I then remembered I wanted to make a little cone piece to sort of make an abstract rocket at the top of the ring piece. So I quickly turned a cone out of a piece of cherry. A scrap piece from the legs was about the right size to use for this. I turned it and I made a whole piece and I sanded it and everything. And then in looking at it next to the top of the ring, it was too long and it just made the ring way too long. So I cut the end off and reshaped it a little stouter. And I can sand that and sort of finish it. That seems better. I can cut off hopefully about what I think I need. And I sanded it a little bit to get it pretty close to the shape of the ring. It has to go from the cone shape to the somewhat rectangular shape of the section of the ring. And I glued that in place. Then I could sand that cone piece and kind of get it to fit with the ring once everything's dry. And I can put finish on everything. And it seems to work. And it came out really fun. And I've sort of made a piece of furniture or something at that scale, so we need to find a good place to put it. Thanks for watching.